They told me my daughter was probably gone forever. But one quiet afternoon, inside my husband's office, I heard a weak voice whisper the word every mother prays to hear: Mom. Disclaimer: this video is a fictional reenactment created for entertainment purposes. All characters, names, events, and situations are entirely fictional and do not depict real people or real events. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Viewer discretion is advised for sensitive topics. 6 months had passed since the day my daughter Emma disappeared. Yet every morning I still woke up expecting to hear her small footsteps running down the hallway. The silence that followed always felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my life. Our house, once filled with laughter and noise, had become painfully quiet. Emma was only 8 years old when she vanished, and the day she went missing changed everything. The police had searched everywhere. They questioned neighbors, checked security cameras, and followed every possible lead. But each trail ended the same way, with nothing. Friends and relatives tried to comfort me, telling me to stay strong and have faith. But faith becomes difficult when every day passes without answers. My husband Daniel had been my biggest support during those terrible months. He held me when I cried and promised me that Emma would come home someday. Daniel was always calm, even when I was falling apart. Sometimes I wondered how he managed to stay so strong. He worked long hours at his office downtown, often coming home late at night with tired eyes. He told me he was working extra hard to pay for private investigators and to make sure we had enough money if Emma needed medical care when she was found. I believed him completely. After all, Daniel had always been a responsible and caring father. Emma adored him. Every night before she went to sleep, he used to read her stories and make funny voices for each character until she laughed so hard she could barely breathe. But as the months passed, the distance between us slowly grew. Grief does strange things to people. Sometimes we would sit at the dinner table in complete silence, staring at Emma's empty chair. I couldn't bring myself to move it away. Daniel rarely talked about the investigation anymore. Whenever I asked him if the police had any updates, he simply shook his head and said there was nothing new. His answers were always short, and his eyes looked tired, as if he carried a weight he couldn't explain. I assumed he was just exhausted from working so much. One afternoon, I was sitting alone in the living room when I noticed the clock on the wall. It was almost 5 in the evening. Daniel had told me that morning that he would probably be working late again. Something about an important meeting and paperwork that needed to be finished. Normally, I would have just waited for him to come home like always. But that day, something inside me wanted to do something different. I remembered how much we used to enjoy going out for dinner before Emma disappeared. For a moment, I thought maybe we both needed a small break from the sadness that had taken over our lives. The idea of surprising Daniel came to my mind almost instantly. I imagined walking into his office with a smile and telling him to stop working for the night. Maybe we could go somewhere quiet, eat together, and talk about something other than police reports and missing posters. It wasn't a big plan, but it felt like the first hopeful thought I had in weeks. I grabbed my coat and car keys and left the house before I could change my mind. The drive to Daniel's office took about 20 minutes. The city streets were busy as usual, filled with people finishing their workday and heading home. Watching them made me realize how strange my life had become. Everyone else seemed to be moving forward, while I felt stuck in the same painful moment that started 6 months ago. Daniel's office building stood tall in the middle of downtown. It was a modern glass building with several floors, filled with different businesses and companies. I had visited him there a few times before, usually during holidays when the office held small celebrations. The security guard at the entrance recognized me and gave me a polite nod as I walked inside. The lobby was quiet, with only a few employees passing by and talking softly. I took the elevator up to the floor where Daniel's office was located. As the elevator doors opened, the familiar hallway appeared in front of me. Bright white lights shined from the ceiling, and the sound of keyboards and distant conversations echoed through the corridor. For a moment I felt nervous, like a child about to perform a surprise for someone special. When I reached the reception desk, the young woman sitting there looked up at me with a slightly confused expression. She recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Carter," she said politely. "I didn't expect to see you today." I smiled and explained that I wanted to surprise Daniel and maybe take him out for dinner. Her expression changed in a way I couldn't fully understand. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Oh, Mr. Carter actually left about an hour ago." Her words caught me off guard. Daniel had clearly told me that morning he would be working late. I stood there for a second, unsure of what to say. Maybe his plans had changed suddenly. Maybe he had stepped out for a meeting or dinner with a client. "Are you sure?" I asked gently. She nodded. "Yes, I saw him leave earlier." The situation felt a little strange, but I didn't think too deeply about it at the time. I thanked her and walked down the hallway toward Daniel's office. His door was slightly open, just the way he often left it when he stepped out for a short time. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside, planning to wait for him until he returned. The room looked mostly the same as always. His large desk near the window, a computer monitor glowing softly, and a tall bookshelf against the wall filled with files and business books. But almost immediately, something felt different. The air inside the office smelled unusual, like fresh paint or recently cut wood. It was a faint smell, but strong enough to catch my attention. I closed the door behind me and walked further into the room, glancing around quietly while I waited. At first, everything seemed normal, yet the strange feeling didn't disappear. It was the kind of feeling that makes the back of your neck tense without knowing exactly why. I stood near the bookshelf, looking at the rows of folders Daniel kept organized there, when suddenly I heard a faint sound from somewhere nearby. A soft, distant knock that seemed to come from behind the wall. For a moment I stood completely still, unsure if what I had heard was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. The office was quiet, and the soft hum of the computer on Daniel's desk filled the room. I looked around slowly, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. My heart had already begun to beat faster, but I tried to calm myself. After everything I had been through over the past 6 months, it wouldn't be surprising if my mind was creating sounds that weren't actually there. I took a slow breath and walked toward the window, thinking that maybe the noise had come from somewhere outside. The city streets below were busy with traffic, horns, and distant voices, but none of it sounded like the faint knock I had just heard. I turned back toward the center of the office and stood there for a moment. Listening carefully, nothing happened. I shook my head slightly, trying to convince myself that it had been nothing. Perhaps a pipe inside the wall had made a strange sound, or maybe something had shifted inside the building. Offices like this were full of strange noises if you paid too much attention. I walked toward Daniel's desk and sat down in the chair across from it, deciding to wait for him. Maybe he had stepped out for coffee or to meet someone nearby. While I waited, I noticed a few small details that felt unusual. A toolbox sat near the corner of the room, partially hidden beside the bookshelf. Daniel was not the type of person who did repairs himself, and I had never seen tools inside his office before. The smell of fresh paint also seemed stronger the longer I stayed in the room. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was noticeable. I glanced around the walls, trying to see if anything had recently been painted or repaired, yet everything looked mostly normal at first glance. Then I heard something else, a faint scratching sound. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer, pressing my ear gently against the wooden side of the bookshelf. At first I heard nothing except my own breathing. The silence stretched for several seconds, making me wonder if I had imagined the sound again. And then it happened. A soft knock, much weaker this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was making the sound had very little strength left. My heart began pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest and ears. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who could possibly be behind that wall? Why would there be knocking coming from inside the office? My hands began to shake slightly as I reached out and touched the edge of the bookshelf. It felt solid and heavy, but something about its position seemed unusual. It was placed directly against the wall without any space behind it, almost as if it were meant to hide something. I pushed against it gently. To my surprise, the bookshelf moved, not easily, but enough to shift slightly away from the wall. The movement made my stomach twist with fear and confusion. Books on the shelves rattled softly as the heavy furniture slid a few inches across the floor. I stopped immediately, staring at the small gap that had appeared between the shelf and the wall. The knocking sound came again. Knock, knock. This time it was clearer than ever. My hands started trembling more noticeably as I gripped the side of the shelf again. I pushed harder, using both arms to slowly move it further away from the wall. The shelf scraped against the floor with a low, grinding sound as it shifted inch by inch. As the gap widened, something hidden behind the bookshelf slowly came into view. It wasn't a normal wall. There was a large wooden panel built into the surface, slightly different in color from the surrounding paint. At first glance, it looked like part of the wall, but now that the bookshelf had been moved, the edges of the panel were clearly visible. Someone had built it carefully so it would stay hidden. My chest tightened as a cold wave of fear ran through my body. Why would there be a secret panel inside Daniel's office? I stepped closer, staring at the wooden surface. The smell of fresh paint was even stronger near the panel. Small marks around the edges suggested it had been installed recently. My hands were shaking so badly now that I had to steady them against the wall. Slowly, almost afraid of what I might hear, I leaned forward and pressed my ear against the wooden panel. At first there was nothing, just silence. Then a weak, trembling sound came from the other side, a voice so soft I almost couldn't recognize it. Mom. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what I had just heard. The voice had been weak and shaky, almost like a whisper. But it was a voice I knew better than any other in the world. My heart slammed against my chest as if it were trying to escape. My hands pressed harder against the wooden panel while my entire body trembled. Emma, I whispered, my voice barely coming out. There was a long pause on the other side of the wall. The silence stretched for several seconds that felt like hours. I held my breath, afraid that maybe I had imagined it again, that my desperate mind had created the sound of my daughter's voice. Then I heard it again, a soft cry. Mom, is that you? The world around me seemed to stop. My legs felt weak, and tears instantly filled my eyes. There was no doubt anymore. That was Emma, my daughter, the child we had been searching for across the entire city for 6 painful months.
Emma!
I shouted, my voice shaking with panic and relief.
Emma, I'm here!
I'm here! I started hitting the wooden panel with my fists, desperate to open it. The wood was solid and barely moved when I pushed against it. Whoever had built this hidden section had done it carefully. My hands slipped along the edges, searching for a handle, a latch, or anything that could open it. "Hold on, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though my entire body was shaking. "Mom is going to get you out." From the other side of the wall, I heard Emma crying softly. The sound broke my heart. She sounded weak and scared. Nothing like the energetic little girl who used to run through our house laughing. "I was knocking?" she whispered faintly. I hoped someone would hear me. Tears ran down my face as I tried to force the panel open again, but it wouldn't move. Panic began to rise inside me. I looked around the office quickly, searching for something I could use to break it. That was when I remembered the toolbox I had seen earlier near the corner of the room. I rushed across the office and grabbed it with shaking hands. Inside were a hammer, a screwdriver, and several other tools. I didn't think twice. I grabbed the hammer and ran back to the panel. "Emma, move away from the wall," I called out loudly. "I'm going to break it open." "Okay," she answered weakly from the other side. I raised the hammer and struck the wooden panel as hard as I could. The loud crack echoed through the office. The wood splintered slightly but didn't break completely. I hit it again and again, each strike filled with desperation and fear. The noise quickly attracted attention. Within seconds, someone rushed into the office behind me. Mrs. Carter. "Did anyone hurt you?" I asked gently. She shook her head slowly. "I was just locked in here," she said quietly. Her voice was weak, but there was something else in her expression, a strange mixture of fear and hesitation. Several minutes later, distant sirens could be heard approaching the building. Police officers and paramedics soon rushed into the office. They quickly began checking Emma's condition and asking questions about what had happened. While one of the officers spoke with me, another gently knelt down beside Emma. "Emma," he said kindly, "do you know who brought you here?" She hesitated. Her small hands tightened around the blanket as she looked down at the floor. Then she said something that made the entire room fall silent. "The man who put me here was someone I know." At first, I thought I had misunderstood what Emma said. My mind was already overwhelmed by the shock of finding her alive behind that hidden wall. The idea that someone she knew had done this felt impossible to accept. I squeezed her hand gently, hoping she would look at me again and maybe explain what she meant. The police officer crouching beside her spoke softly, trying not to frighten her. "Emma, it's okay. You're safe now. Can you tell us who it was?" Emma looked nervous. Her eyes moved slowly around the room as if she were afraid someone might still be watching. I placed my arm around her shoulders and pulled her closer to me. "You can tell them," I said gently. "No one is going to hurt you anymore." For a few seconds, she remained silent, staring at the floor. The room was filled with people now. Police officers, paramedics, and several employees who had gathered near the doorway. Everyone was waiting to hear her answer. Emma swallowed and spoke in a quiet voice. "He told me not to tell anyone." The officer nodded calmly. "You don't have to be afraid of him anymore." Emma slowly raised her head. Her eyes met mine for a brief moment, and something in that look made my heart tighten with sudden fear. "Dad brought me here," she whispered. The words felt like a sudden explosion inside my mind. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My entire body went numb, and I stared at her, waiting for her to say something else that would correct what she had just said. It had to be a misunderstanding. Emma had been trapped in a dark room for months. Maybe she was confused or scared. Maybe she meant someone else. "Emma," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you mean your dad?" She nodded slowly. "Yes." The room became silent. Even the police officers looked surprised by the answer. One of them glanced at another officer, clearly realizing how serious the situation had just become. "That can't be right," I said quickly, shaking my head. "Daniel would never do something like that. He's been helping the police search for her since the day she disappeared." Emma didn't argue with me. She just looked down again, holding the blanket tightly around her shoulders. The officer who had been speaking with her stood up and quietly called another detective over. They stepped aside and began discussing the situation in low voices. While they talked, paramedics carefully examined Emma. They checked her pulse, her temperature, and asked her simple questions about how she was feeling. She looked tired and weak, but they said she seemed stable. My mind, however, was spinning with confusion. I kept replaying Emma's words over and over in my head. "Dad brought me here?" It didn't make sense. Daniel had spent months comforting me, promising that we would find our daughter. He had cried with me during the early days of the investigation. He had talked with detectives and attended every meeting about the case. How could the same man be responsible for hiding her behind a secret wall in his own office? The police officers soon began searching the office carefully. One of them examined the hidden room behind the wall, while another photographed everything inside. They found a small mattress, several empty food containers, bottles of water, and a few blankets. Everything inside suggested that someone had been keeping Emma there for a long time. A detective approached me after a few minutes. "Mrs. Carter," he said calmly, "we're going to need to ask you some questions." I nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. "Do you know if your husband had any reason to build a hidden room in this office?" "No," I answered immediately. I had no idea it even existed. The detective wrote something down in his notebook. "Did your husband ever mention doing construction or repairs here recently?" I thought back over the past few weeks. The long nights Daniel had spent working, the tired look in his eyes when he came home, the strange smell of paint I had noticed earlier. "No," I said quietly. "He never mentioned anything." Another officer approached with a small box they had found inside one of Daniel's desk drawers. Inside were several documents and envelopes. The detective opened them and began reading carefully. His expression slowly changed as he went through the papers. "What is it?" another officer asked. "These are financial statements," the detective replied. He flipped through several pages, studying the numbers. "Looks like your husband was in serious debt." The words made my stomach tighten. "Debt?" I asked. "That can't be right. Daniel always managed our finances carefully." The detective continued reading. "Large gambling losses," he said. "Hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past year." My head began to spin again. Daniel had never told me anything about gambling. As far as I knew, he rarely even visited casinos. But the evidence in the detective's hands seemed very real. Another officer soon joined the conversation. "We also checked the building's security cameras," he said. "Your husband has been entering this office late at night, several times a week." "Doing what?" the detective asked. "Carrying bags?" The officer replied, "Food bags." The room felt colder with every new piece of information. Slowly, the picture began forming in the detectives' minds, and their expressions became more serious. One of them looked back at the hidden room behind the wall. "It looks like he was bringing food here regularly," he said quietly. My heart felt like it was breaking with every word. The detective closed the folder of financial documents and turned toward me. "Why believe your husband may have staged your daughter's disappearance?" he said carefully. I stared at him in disbelief. "Why would he do that?" "He may have been planning a ransom," the detective explained. "If he was in this much debt, He might have believed kidnapping his own daughter would bring him money. The idea sounded so cruel and unbelievable that I could barely understand it. "You're saying he planned all of this?" I asked. "That's what the evidence suggests," the detective said. Another officer walked over at that moment with more information from the security footage. "There's something else," he said. Everyone turned toward him. The night Emma disappeared, the cameras showed Daniel entering the building after midnight. The detective looked surprised. "With Emma?" The officer nodded. "She appears to be unconscious when he carries her inside." The police arrested Daniel later that same night. By the time they found him, the entire building was surrounded by officers and flashing lights. I didn't see the moment they placed him in handcuffs, but one of the detectives later told me he had tried to act surprised when they confronted him. At first, he denied everything. He claimed the accusations were ridiculous and insisted that someone else must have hidden Emma in his office without his knowledge. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The security cameras showed him entering the office building multiple times late at night, carrying bags of food and supplies. The hidden room behind the wall had clearly been constructed recently, and workers who had done renovations in the building remembered Daniel personally requesting privacy during certain repairs. On top of that, the financial documents discovered in his desk revealed the truth about his debts. Daniel had lost an enormous amount of money through gambling over the past year. The numbers were far worse than I had imagined. When the detectives questioned him again, the story slowly began to fall apart. Eventually, he stopped denying it. He admitted that he had planned everything months before Emma disappeared. The debts had become so large that he saw no other way out. Instead of asking for help or facing the consequences of his mistakes, he chose a path that destroyed our entire family. According to the police report, Daniel's plan had been simple but cruel. He intended to stage Emma's kidnapping and demand a ransom from one of his wealthy business partners. He believed that if the kidnapping looked real enough, the partner would pay quickly without involving the police. Once he received the money, he planned to secretly release Emma somewhere safe and claim she had escaped from her kidnappers. But things didn't go the way he expected. The moment Emma was reported missing, the police became heavily involved. News about the case spread quickly across the city, and investigators began treating it as a serious child abduction. Daniel quickly realized that asking for ransom would only make him the main suspect. Instead of ending the situation, he panicked. Rather than letting Emma go, he kept her hidden in the secret room he had built inside his office. He convinced himself that if he waited long enough, the investigation might slow down or the police might start looking somewhere else. During the day, he acted like a worried father, speaking with detectives and comforting me while pretending to search for our daughter. And at night, he visited the office. He brought Emma food and water, sometimes staying for hours. The police said he tried to make the room comfortable enough for her to survive, but it was still nothing more than a small, cold space hidden behind a wall. When the detectives told me all of this, I felt a strange mixture of emotions that I could barely understand. Part of me was furious. Another part of me felt completely empty. The man I had trusted for years, the man I believed was helping me search for our missing daughter, had been the one hiding her the entire time. The betrayal felt deeper than anything I had ever experienced. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. News reporters learned that a missing child had been found hidden inside her father's office. Television crews began appearing outside the building, hoping to film updates about the investigation. The case that had already shocked the city became even more disturbing when the truth came out. At first, I wanted to disappear from the attention. Emma needed rest and medical care, and I wanted to focus completely on helping her recover. But something inside me refused to stay silent. Daniel had spent months pretending to be the perfect father while secretly keeping our daughter imprisoned behind a wall. People in the community still respected him. Many of them couldn't believe he was capable of such cruelty. I wanted the truth to be known. The first time I spoke publicly about what happened was during a news interview a few weeks later. I was nervous sitting under the bright studio lights, but I knew why I was there. I told the entire story from beginning to end. The day Emma disappeared, the months of searching, and the moment I heard the knocking behind the wall. The reporter asked me how it felt to discover that my own husband was responsible. I paused for a moment before answering. It felt like my whole life had been a lie, I said quietly. The interview aired that night, and within hours, thousands of people were talking about the case online. Messages of support flooded in from strangers across the country. Many people were shocked and angry that a father could do something so terrible to his own child. As more details of the investigation became public, Daniel's reputation quickly collapsed. His business partners immediately cut ties with him. The company he had spent years building began losing clients almost overnight. Several employees resigned, saying they could not work for someone capable of such actions. The same community that once admired him now saw him as a criminal. For Daniel, the consequences grew worse every day. He remained in jail while prosecutors prepared a long list of charges against him, including kidnapping, child abuse, and unlawful imprisonment. Each charge carried serious prison sentences. The detectives told me the evidence against him was so strong that a conviction was almost certain. But for me, the legal punishment was only part of what mattered. I wanted Emma to know that the truth would never be hidden again. Every interview, every documentary, and every public statement I made had the same purpose. I wanted people to understand what had really happened behind that office wall. I wanted them to see the reality behind the man who had fooled everyone for so long. Daniel had once been known as a successful businessman and respected father. Now his name was connected to something very different. The father who kidnapped his own daughter and kept her hidden just a few feet away from the world for 6 long months while pretending to search for her every single day. Life after Daniel's arrest was a strange mix of relief, fear, and exhaustion. Emma and I returned home together, but the house felt almost unfamiliar. Every room carried memories of the 6 months we had endured without her. And yet, now that she was back, there was a cautious sense of hope in the air. The first few nights were the hardest. Emma would wake up suddenly, her small body trembling, and ask if the nightmare was real. I held her close, whispering assurances that she was safe, that no one could ever lock her away again, that she was finally home. I found myself checking every corner, every locked door, convinced that some hidden danger still lingered. I knew logically that Daniel was behind bars, yet my instincts were slower to trust reality. Emma's recovery was gradual. She slept longer each night and began eating normally again. Though she often had moments of silence where she stared at nothing, her mind lost somewhere between fear and memory. I didn't pressure her to talk about her experience. Instead, I focused on simple routines, helping her get dressed, preparing meals together, reading her favorite books, and slowly reintroducing little joys that had been missing for months. We went for walks in the park and visited familiar places where Emma used to play, trying to recreate the sense of safety and normalcy she deserved. Each day, I noticed small improvements: a brighter smile, a laugh that came unbidden, or a question about her favorite cartoon instead of silence or fear. Even with these signs of healing, the memory of those 6 months hung over us. I often wondered what had gone through her mind while locked away, how she had coped with the darkness and the uncertainty. Sometimes she would mention little things, like wishing for her favorite stuffed animal or imagining me coming to find her, and I realized that those thoughts had kept her alive. But other times, she would shrink slightly at loud noises or sudden movement, and I would see the lingering traces of trauma. I learned to be patient with her, understanding that recovery was not linear and that she needed time to feel safe in her own home again. The outside world reacted to our story with shock and curiosity. News outlets continued covering the case, and friends and neighbors expressed sympathy and relief. But while some were supportive, others whispered, asking questions about how such a thing could happen. Emma's school administrators made accommodations, allowing her extra time and space to adjust before returning fully to the classroom. I remained a constant presence, sitting in meetings with teachers, ensuring they understood her needs and the fragility of her emotional state. The world outside had changed for us just as dramatically as the world inside our home. As the days turned into weeks, I began reflecting on the events that had led to Emma's rescue. I thought about the moment I decided to visit Daniel's office, a simple choice that had changed everything. If I had not gone that day, if I had waited at home like I usually did, I might never have discovered the hidden wall. I realized that small moments, seemingly insignificant decisions, could have profound consequences. The faint knocking, the smell of paint, and the uneasy feeling in the office had all led me to find Emma. That combination of awareness, intuition, and courage had been the key to saving her life. I often told Emma, gently, that it was her hope that kept me going, and in turn, it was my determination that brought her home. One quiet evening, a few weeks after Emma returned, she climbed into bed beside me and whispered a question that I hadn't anticipated. "Mom, how did you know to move the bookshelf?" I paused, realizing that this was the first time she had asked about the exact moment of discovery. I thought about it carefully. The strange smell, the faint sound behind the wall, and that tiny knock she had made to signal her presence. I tried to explain it simply. "Sometimes, Emma, when something feels wrong or strange, you just have to trust your instincts. That little sound you made, it was hope. And hope is never quiet enough to ignore." She smiled softly, resting her head against my chest, and I felt a profound sense of connection between us, a bond strengthened by shared trauma and survival. Even now, months later, I find myself reflecting on how fragile life can be. I think about Daniel, the man I had loved and trusted, and I shudder at the depth of betrayal. But I also think about the resilience of a child who survived unimaginable circumstances, and the strength it took to hold on until rescue came. I realize that trauma changes people, but it does not define them. Emma is still my daughter, still playful and curious, and yet she carries the strength of someone who has faced fear beyond what most adults can imagine. I see that in her eyes every day, a quiet determination to reclaim the life that was taken from her. The process of healing continues, slowly but steadily. We establish new routines, new boundaries, and new ways of communicating. I encourage Emma to express her feelings openly, and I try to create an environment where she can feel safe exploring her emotions without judgment or fear. We spend time together, often quietly, simply enjoying each other's presence. I have also taken care to maintain my own emotional well-being, attending counseling and support groups for parents who have endured trauma alongside their children. I know that my ability to remain strong and composed has a direct impact on her recovery, and that awareness drives me to continue healing alongside her. Sometimes, late at night, I sit quietly in the living room, listening to the soft sounds of Emma breathing in her bedroom. I think about the knock behind the wall, about the hidden room that could have been a permanent prison, and about the extraordinary twist of fate that brought her back to me. In those moments, I feel a mixture of gratitude, relief, and awe. I understand now that life can be terrifying, unpredictable, and cruel. But it can also be miraculous, filled with moments where hope and courage intersect to change everything. And as I hold Emma close in my thoughts, I realize that the knock behind the wall was more than a sound. It was the signal that life, no matter how dark, still reaches out to those who refuse to give up. Emma is finally safe, and our lives are slowly returning to normal. But the memory of those 6 months will never fade. This story is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can reach us in the most unexpected ways. If this story moved you or gave you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Also, comment below and let me know what you would have done if you were in my shoes. Would you have discovered the hidden truth or walked away? Stay tuned, because our next story is even more shocking, and you won't believe what happens next.